Hello, I'm Adam from TartyBikes. Every time we send out a complete bike to you, we build it up in our workshop, set everything up and make sure it's all perfect before we ship it out to you. But to get it in the box, we need to take a few key components off, so we're just going to show you how to assemble your bike to a fully rideable standard and also add in a few quick maintenance tips at the end. So the first thing we need to do is remove the top cap from the steering tube so we can fit the handlebar and stem. For this we're going to use a 5mm Allen key. I'm going to undo the top cap from the fork steering tube. Just put this aside because we'll need it again in a second. From here we need to get the handlebar and stem unit and fit it onto the steering tube of the fork. That should just slide over nice and easily. And put the top cap back in again. You don't need to do this very tight for now because we'll look at adjusting the headset in a few minutes. Okay, so next up we're going to put the front wheel in. The bikes usually come with some axle bolts and washers or axle nuts. Either way, you need to make sure you've got a bit of a gap between the end of the axle and the axle bolt or the washer so you can fit the fork in there. So pick the front end of the bike up and just slide the wheel in. Just squeeze the front wheel into the forks. And then use your Allen key or 15mm ring spanner to tighten the front axle bolts. You put a bit of pressure on the stem here, that'll make sure the wheel locates properly in the forks and it'll be nicely centred for when you ride it. And nip up to finish. Make sure it's nice and tight, especially if you have a front disc brake. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at are the brake levers. We usually send these out facing backwards, so it saves a bit of space in the box, but you need to turn them around before you ride the bike. So usually it's a 5mm Allen key. Undo this bolt and slide the lever around and nip it back up again. A nice angle to start with is if you're over the bike and your hands are straight, your brake lever should be just there in a straight line with your arm. So do the other one as well, and just line them up by eye. And then you can also adjust them while riding if you want to get a better position. So from there, we need to preload the headset. This top cap bolt governs that. Just give it a gentle little tweak. It doesn't need to be tight at all. And then, if you grab hold of the front brake and rock the bike backwards and forwards, if there's any play, add a bit more tension to the bolt. If not, pick the front end of the bike up, turn the steering left and right to check there's no binding. If it's okay, we're good to go. So the next thing we're going to do is align the stem and the front wheel. If you close one of your eyes and look on a line down the bike, you can see if the front wheel is aligned with the stem. If not, we generally hold the handlebars and tap the front wheel with our foot just to get it squared up. On the outer stem we need a 6mm Allen key for the two bolts on the side. Tighten these up nice and evenly, go backwards and forwards from one bolt to the other so you get a nice even clamping. Again, they don't need to be super tight, so if you do crash it can spin round. What I usually do here, just to make sure it's nice and tight, grab the front wheel between your knees and twist the bars left and right to make sure there's no movement. So the bike's nearly there now. The last thing to do is fit the pedals. The pedals are marked R and L on the end of the axle to make sure you put them in the right and the left hand crank because they do actually have different threads. Before you fit the pedal, make sure you put plenty of grease on the thread. Always fit the pedal at first by hand. The right hand pedal uses a normal clockwise thread and away we go. Then if you hold the flat on the pedal, rotate the cranks backwards, that puts it in a little bit quicker. Okay, so now the other pedal. The left-hand one is a left-hand thread, so be careful of this. Again, plenty of grease on the thread, and you wind it in with the crank at the top, forwards to tighten. Tighten the pedal in a couple of turns by hand at first, and then hold the flats and wind the crank backwards. So next up, we need to make sure the pedals are nice and tight, and for this we need a 15mm open-ended spanner. So, as before, with the crank arm facing upwards, forwards is tightening and backwards is loosening. Locate the spanner onto the pedal, rotate it forwards, and do it nice and tight. Same with the right hand pedal. Start from the top, forwards to tighten. Just wind that round carefully, and then to finish off, plenty of force to keep it nice and tight. Okay, so your bike's fully built and ready to ride. Now we're just going to run through a few basic maintenance tips which will help the life of your bike. Still on the subject of pedals, every time you ride, the pedal actually can come loose for the first few rides. We recommend keeping these tight every 10 or 15 minutes for your first 4 or 5 rides. Similarly, the crank bolts, which is done up with an 8mm Allen key, need plenty of attention every 10 or 15 minutes for the first few rides again. Another thing that may come loose during your first few bits of riding is the chain. And to adjust the chain tension, first you need to undo the axle nut or axle bolt. Then add a small amount of tension to this bolt on the back of the chain tug and make sure you use the same amount of turns on the left and the right chain tug and that will pull the wheel back squarely. Once your chain's back to a correct tension, do the axle nut or bolt back up again, and away you go. The third thing that may bed in when the bike's new is the rear brake. There's a couple of ways to adjust this. You can either use the barrel adjuster at the lever, or the nut which holds the cable into the brake arm. Generally we use the barrel adjuster for finer adjustments, and this bolt here if you need to adjust the brake quite a lot. The second thing is making sure that your pads are nice and tight. These use a 5mm nut on the end of the brake pad, so for the first couple of rides, make sure you keep an eye on this so your brake pad doesn't wobble. The third thing is the brake balance. You need to make sure, for best performance, that both the brake pads hit the rim at the same time. So when the bike's new, both these arms will move the same amount. If you do end up with one brake arm moving more than the other, you can adjust it with the tension screws on the side of the brake arm. This little screw here, if you screw it in clockwise, will add tension to the arm and pull it further back, making the balance correct. And hopefully, you get your brakes centred again. So, I hope your bike's all set up and ready to ride. Enjoy it, and if you've got any more questions, don't hesitate to give us a call.